Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. Comes to us all the way from the beautiful country of Australia, in Melbourne to be exact. His name is Paul Moder, Moder. You can see his last name if you're watching this on Rockfin, Rumble, or X. And he was a suggested guest, and most of the suggested guests I've had have been outstanding. We're doing kind of a pre-show breakdown about this case, very important really in world history, but specifically in Australian history, and that is called commonly referred to as the Port Arthur Massacre. It happened in 1996 in a town in South Tasmania. If you know the geography, Australia is this big continent, but just underneath there's an island called Tasmania, and then Port Arthur is very south of that. You can look it up online, probably maybe the southern part of Tasmania. But the person who committed the crime, his name was Martin Bryant. He supposedly killed 35, supposedly, the cover story. But Paul can talk more about the cover story. But there's more to this story, like many other things. Like we've had these mass shootings here in the States. Columbine comes to mind that really capture the public's interest. And usually there's more to the Columbine story for sure. I think there's more to the Port Arthur. We were talking about that in the pre-show, but Paul can talk more about that. So, Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Welcome.
For people who haven't heard your name or your research, your YouTube channel is the WASP Files. So I'll put a link to that. You have a bunch of videos there. Maybe you can talk about your background, how you got started looking into this, and then what you've discovered.
Yeah, I'm a writer and a filmmaker and have been for many decades. And way back in 2016, I was shopping around for a feature film concept and was looking at one of the most blackest days in Australian history, which was the Port Arthur Massacre, where a young man had gone down to a sleepy little part of Australia, which was Tasmania. There's an old historical penal colony down there from the 1800s. And usually we have tens of thousands of tourists attend every year. And this person went in there with high-powered semi-automatic rifles and opened fire on the civilian population, killed 35 men, women, and children, and injured 28 others. And I decided that as black an incident as it was, that I thought that it led to some of the most enormous changes in gun ownership in Australia in our nation's history, and I thought it would be a great topic to make a feature film out of. So I started to research, and I didn't want to just read what I'd read online and publications and online sites and so on. I wanted to speak firsthand to the people that were directly involved, the police, the first responders, the survivors, the families, people who grew up with Martin Bryant, who was the convicted perpetrator, people who went to prison with him. And I dug deep, very deep, deeper than most. And very quickly I discovered that I couldn't write this script. There were so many holes in the mainstream narrative, and I don't mean a few, I mean a lot, that I was a bit astounded. And I went down a very deep rabbit hole of trying to find out the truth behind the Port Arthur Massacre, and the mainstream narrative didn't seem to marry up with that.
What is the mainstream narrative? It's a lone guy who's not very bright, had a lot of money, decided to do it for fame and fortune or whatever, and he had a gripe supposedly with some landowner or something, and so those were that's the surface story, that's his motive or something, right?
Yeah, the convicted perpetrator, Martin Bryant, is quite an enigma. It's generally regarded that he had an IQ of 66, which makes him an 11-year-old child. He certainly was a disturbed individual, and he grew up very sort of dysfunctional, socially isolated. He tried very hard. He grew up in a normal family, and he had, I won't say that he had violent tendencies, but he certainly had antisocial tendencies. He's generally painted as being someone that was sort of sadistic and cruel and violent, but the research that I've done has indicated that wasn't necessarily the case. There was a very compassionate and gentle side to him. He was very much like a child. And in fact, in 1993, after he inherited a lot of money, he was placed on a guardianship order by the Hobart Supreme Court, rendered mentally incapable of managing his affairs. But he did come into a lot of money, and that was because he'd befriended an eccentric heiress to the Tattersall's lottery fortune by the name of Helen Harvey, and they became friends. And they shared a love of animals together. Martin loved animals, and so did Helen. And they had a plethora of dogs and cats and birds. And she died under very interesting circumstances and left him a large amount of money, something in the region of over $500,000, and property as well, such as a house in Newtown and a farm as well. So Martin came into a lot of money. And Martin had girlfriends as well, so he wasn't totally lonely, isolated. You know, the lone gunman, you know, sitting in his shack alone, which has been perpetrated by the media. You know, he tried hard, but he had difficulty communicating, and he was certainly ostracized by his local community.
So he kind of had an interesting background. He was all very young when this incident happened, right?
He was 29 years old.
He was 29. Okay, I got it wrong.
And
So
he was a good-looking man. He had long blonde, sort of like surfy look, had long blonde hair, and was generally regarded to be a good-looking fellow. But he used to flaunt his wealth around Tasmania, and Tasmania is more of a rural sort of no-nonsense community. So people sort of ridiculed him a little bit. His antics were at times inappropriate and you know, quite brash and bold. So, you know, people sort of looked down upon him quite a bit. And the story is that he had, you know, developed a grudge against, you know, some of the community members, and that's what caused him to commit this massacre. But the story goes much deeper than that.
But he didn't live in Port Arthur, is that right? He lived somewhere else, or did he live in Port Arthur?
No, he lived in Newtown, which was, you know, a small town, you know, not too far. Tasmania is a very small place, so you can drive, you know, pretty much in a number of hours to get to any part of the island. It's a small island. And the Port Arthur historic site is just its own government-run tourist site, so everyone knows about it and would have gone down there at various times in their lives. But he lived in a smaller town called Newtown.
Gotcha. So he somehow traveled the 20 miles or whatever to Port Arthur to commit the crime. And how did he get all these guns? Like, he's had the kind of a small arsenal, didn't he?
Well, supposedly. I've dug very deeply into the origins of the firearms. A little bit of background in that at the time, Tasmania and Queensland, which are two states in Australia, they were known to have the most loose gun laws in the country. And the Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, prior to Port Arthur and prior to becoming Prime Minister, had drafted up what he wanted to be national gun legislation, and he was trying to get all of the states to fall in line, but they were balking at that. And one of the New South Wales premiers, Barry Unsworth, was famous for storming out of the meeting and quoting that there'll never be uniform gun laws in Australia until we have a massacre in Tasmania.
Wow.
And lo and behold, a short time after we did.
Wow.
We also have a very advocate for anti-gun control by the name of Roland Brown. He also was stated in the papers as saying there will be a massacre in Tasmania. So you were required to have a license in Tasmania, despite what people think, but you could purchase high-powered semi-automatic rifles. There wasn't a proliferation of that kind of firearm, but they were, of course, available. And now, after John Howard's sweeping legislation, they've all been banned, heavily restricted in this country.
Right. So it was an issue. There's always been this kind of gun control thing, and then this, just by happenstance, there's a mass murder in 1996 in the place with the most loose regulations. It's kind of, Tasmania is maybe more of a frontier island than maybe some other parts of Australia, right? Like it kind of has that reputation. Is that correct?
It's a little bit like a law unto its own, and it's an interesting place, Tasmania, very insular, and they like to keep to themselves and consider themselves a bit separate from the mainland. I think an important aspect to note with the Port Arthur massacre was this was way back in 1996, and at the time this was the biggest mass shooting in the world by a lone gunman at the time, or one of. And it didn't happen in other parts of the world, such as America, but in this sleepy little island called Tasmania. It was a major, major event. One of the outrageous aspects of that was that with such a crime of this magnitude, we didn't have an open trial. There was no open trial, and we have a coronial inquest, which is mandated by the states to look into any kind of crime where there's violent death or death by fire, or if foreigners die on Australian soil. We didn't have a coronial inquest either. That was commenced and then it was squashed by the federal government. John Howard had squashed any chance of a coronial inquest, and we didn't have a royal commission either. A royal commission is like a public inquest, and because we're part of the Commonwealth, that's a very detailed examination of events. So the biggest mass shooting in the world at the time didn't warrant any of those judicial processes. And in essence, there's been a comprehensive shutdown of the information that would determine the circumstances of that crime.
It's incredible. So, I mean, just the fact that he was able to murder 35 people is extraordinary. And he injured another 23. So it's like a total of 55 people or something like that, right? That got shot.
28 were injured, 35 killed. And it is, by any intents and purposes, an astounding feat for any one person to achieve, notwithstanding someone with quite considerable psychological, emotional, mental, and physiological disadvantages. A lot of people here have stated that there are very few people in the world that could have that kind of aptitude and skill to be able to carry out a massacre of that proportion. Most modern day terrorists would consider that a huge success, as distressing as that sounds. And here we have a disadvantaged male who apparently wasn't that proficient with firearms. The weapons that were used were a Colt SP1, which is a civilian version. It is an AR-15 style rifle, one of the earlier type, and a semi-automatic high-powered rifle called an FN-FAL. So those firearms, people say, are, yes, in the wrong hands, can be used to devastating effect. We've certainly seen that in the States with the AR-15. But this was a person that there are a lot of questions about whether or not he could have carried out that. And then, of course, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there were other parties involved and that the person who perpetrated that massacre was not Martin Bryant.
Remarkable. So is it possible that he didn't even fire a shot?
Martin Bryant was definitely involved, because one of the aspects of the shooting was it was a multiply staged event. The initial shooting took place down at the Port Arthur historical site in a cafe where a lot of victims were taken. And then the shooter continued a rampage down near the tourist buses before travelling up the road to a toll booth, commandeering a vehicle, executing the occupants, then kidnapping someone after that on the way from a service station, taking that vehicle to a little cottage, an Airbnb cottage called Seascape Cottage, where it had been pre-set up as the final siege, if you like. And the owners of that cottage were murdered prior to. And Martin Bryant was arrested at that Seascape Cottage. There was some negotiation with the police on the phone, which was quite odd. It was like he was playing a role, if you like. I spoke to the police negotiator, and he said that it was like he was reading from a script, and he was calling himself Jamie. And At some point, the cottage had been set on fire, and Martin Bryant had run out on fire and was arrested by the Special Operations Group police. And he was then, accused of being the person that perpetrated the entirety of that crime. But there is evidence to suggest, and certainly people theorising, that he may have been kept at Seascape, but that he did not perpetrate the crimes that took place down at Port Arthur. So whether or not he fired any shots is another question.
Interesting. It would have been a better crime and wrapped up if he died in the fire at Seascape, right? So like that's kind of like some of these operations here in the States, they die in a hail of bullets and it's all cleaned up, done. Our hands are washed. He's dead. Do you think he was supposed to survive?
Look, I think if we look at the notion of false flags, and certainly a lot of the shootings that take place around the world and particularly in the States, there always seems to be these questions where you would imagine something like this is black and white. That say, okay, we know that's the person that was the perpetrator. We have all the evidence. We go to trial. There's an open trial and all of that's presented, and then you can make a solid determination. And that is not the case. So because we didn't have an open trial or a coronial inquest, crucial witnesses, some of them who knew Martin Bryant from when he was a child growing up, tendered witness statements saying that the person they saw on the day was not Martin Bryant.
Wow.
Also, I spoke to the forensics department who, quote, crawled all over that cafe where the shooting took place. And they collected shell casings. There was DNA on a food tray where the shooter had a meal. And none of that evidence has ever seen the light of day. We haven't got any comprehensive evidence that's been tendered in court or available to the public. And also on top of that, they placed an initial 30-year ban on the release of any hard evidence from 1996. This was by the Hobart Supreme Court. It was due to expire next year. Then I found out that the Tasmanian Archives Heritage Office had extended the ban under the highest restrictive category, E75, Chief Police Commissioner's eyes only, for a further 75 years, till 2091. So in all that time, we've never had any evidence that was tendered in court. Witnesses who contradicted the mainstream narrative have never had their say, never been able to present their witness statements. And there was something like 200 witness statements taken. So yes, if we consider that there was an effort to try and cover up any evidence, Martin Bryant certainly should have died in the fire at Seascape Cottage, and then there would be very little questioning. But he didn't. He woke up on fire. His back was on fire, and ran through the house. And people were theorising, well, why his front should have really been burnt. But he ran out and was arrested by the Special Operations Group, quote, grinning and out with the fairies. So their theory is that he was drugged and kept at the cottage and thrown face down on a bed, and then the cottage was set alight and he woke up on fire and ran out. This is all, of course, yet to be determined. But without an open trial, without an inquest, and without release of any hard evidence, can we say 100% that he was the perpetrator?
Right. Wow. And so there's different things, and how he was also like traveling up until before the event, right? Like I remember that he was kind of a world traveler, which is kind of strange for somebody developmentally delayed. Is that true?
That's true. Martin came into a lot of money, and because of the guardianship order, he was placed on, they placed his money into financial management by a trustee. But he was allotted a certain amount of money, and so he was traveling all over the world. He went to the United States, went to the UK, to Europe, and different states of Australia. So yes, I guess he has the ability to be able to book tickets, book in luggage, organise, transportation and accommodation. As I said, there's a lot of mystery about the character of Martin Bryant, for someone who is, pretty much propped up as the poster boy for unintelligent, sadistic evil, there were indications that there was almost like two sides to Martin Bryant, and that there may also have been a side that was not so much intelligent, but at least able to function. I mean, one thing that's very important for me to say is that, I don't consider myself a conspiracy theorist. A lot of what I'm trying to do is to just ask questions, because in the absence of information, I was always taught that you ask questions. You don't just blindly accept what the media tells you, and certainly what the government doesn't tell you. So in many ways, I found myself on this journey, and it's a grim journey. It's a thorn in my side. I'm not here for, to be some kind of social influencer or gain popularity. I certainly don't profit from the WASP Files. It actually costs me money. But I have questions, as many Australians do, that we can't get answers to. And you are very quickly discredited and shut down once you start to ask those questions. And of course, the repugnant term conspiracy theorist and tinfoil hat wearer is bandied about. But it is certainly an event that is not black and white and hasn't been explored properly. So people to this day are calling for answers. Some of these are the victims. I've got good friends who are survivors from Port Arthur. One of them took a bullet in the throat on the day and remarkably survived. And he told me 100% the shooter was not Martin Bryant. And he tendered a witness statement to that effect. So these people never had their say. And I want to give people their say. I want people to have the right to be able to question events. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
He's very distinctive looking. He has like the bright blonde hair, whatever. So it's kind of strange that, you would say that's him. This is the guy, unless he was wearing some kind of camouflage or something like that. But what's your impression on the general populace of Australia? Do they think that Port Arthur is suspicious?
It's hard to say. I do think that generally, if most of the population, if we assume that they buy what the mainstream media feeds them, which is sadly sometimes the case, then I would say the majority probably think that he was the sole perpetrator. But certainly part of what I'm trying to do is educate people on what they don't know about the Port Arthur massacre, and what the media certainly won't tell them. So since I launched the WASP Files, I've had a lot of comments and people going, wow, I didn't know that. And that just shows me that people aren't privy to the information, and it's all out there. I'd say to people, you don't have to take my word for it. Do your research, dig deep as I have, speak to people. And in regards to his appearance, yes, he was very distinctive looking. But of the 200 plus witness statements that were taken, most of those people didn't know Martin Bryant. All they saw was a young man with long blonde flowing hair and a dark coat. Conversely, there were people, as I said, that did know Martin, that worked at the Broad Arrow Cafe and at the Port Arthur Historical Site. They knew Martin, and they tendered statements saying the person there on the day was not Martin Bryant. He was described as having a different appearance. So it doesn't mean, of course, that it may not have been Martin Bryant, but without those determinations and their opportunity to tender witness statements, I don't believe personally that his guilt was proven beyond reasonable doubt in a court of law, which it should be. We also had a problem with our media. Most people said, yes, it was Martin Bryant, but a little known fact was that someone had broken into Martin Bryant's house the day after the massacre while the police were distracted by the media out the front and stole a photograph. And that ended up on the front page of every main newspaper in Australia and went around the world saying, with titles like, "This is the man," and "The face of a killer." Now that's illegal. He hadn't even been charged. This is the day after. So any chance of an unbiased, unprejudiced trial was lost. And they were sort of slapped across the wrist for that. But that is a very serious transgression. We also have very clear examples where the media had taken Martin Bryant's photo and deliberately doctored it to raise his eyebrows and manipulate his eyes to make him look wild and crazed. And I've done an episode on that. And that's so obvious that they were just demonizing this person rather than taking an unbiased and investigative approach as to who this person was and the circumstances of his guilt. The only thing that put Martin Bryant in jail for the rest of his life was a guilty plea and a supposed confession. Martin Bryant's defense lawyer, John Avery, was anything but a defense lawyer. He did not go for an insanity plea. He did not bring to the pre-trial hearing any of the transgressions by the media or the fact that when Martin was interviewed by the police, he had no legal counsel or guardian present. Technically, that would have made that whole interview illegal. And there is some very spurious question about the nature of his supposed confession, and I have credible evidence that he was held in prison for 5 months, pretty much in solitary confinement.
Wow,
and
that's torture. That's torture. Yeah.
And I don't mean mistreatment. I mean a premeditated, directed, and sustained form of torture to extract a confession from him. Risdon is a very dark and black hole of a prison. It came under its own coronial inquest in 2009. But I'm following that up with Amnesty International, and we'll be looking at human rights lawyers as well, because
that's a tech. I don't know if you know this, Paul, but that's a technique to elicit confessions. Is you psychologically isolate them, torture them, give them bad food, and people will say anything after it drives you crazy. They'll say whatever you want. Sure. That's what they do before. There's stories like that here in the States. People in prisons know these techniques and stuff like that. The public doesn't, but wow.
It's very distressing. This is Australia and it's not North Korea, and we don't torture people. So, I've got to follow this through. It's very credible evidence. I have to, of course, determine that as much as possible. But that certainly throws into doubt the reason why Martin Bryant confessed and was put in prison. His defense lawyer also went to his mother, Carleen Bryant, after 5 months, because Martin had staunchly held a not guilty plea, and said, look, you've got to get him to change his plea. So she confessed in her book, My Story, that she went to the prison with John Avery and told Martin, if you don't change your plea to guilty, you'll never see me or your sister Lindy again. Result, Martin changes his plea, case closed, no need for a trial, no need to present evidence or witness statements. He's tossed in jail and they throw away the key. So without a coronial inquest, open trial, cross-examination of Martin, we don't have the answers. And to this day, not one journalist in 29 years has interviewed Martin Bryant. I tried to contact him, and my letter was seized as a risk to prison security. Very few people are allowed to see Martin Bryant. He is locked away in a black hole, and all the media that are very quick to decry, oh, yes, he's guilty, he's an evil, sadistic killer. Not one of them has interviewed him in 29 years. They're not permitted to.
Incredible.
None of them have had access to all the hard evidence, the ballistics and DNA, and none of them have interviewed some of the witnesses that contradict the mainstream story. They cherry pick some of the other witnesses and put them on programs, but the people that I've spoken to have only had their say on the WASP Files. So you don't have to take my word for it as well. You can hear directly from some of the survivors' mouths, like Wendy Skur and Stephen Howard. These people don't follow the mainstream story because they were there and they had a different experience. It's a shutdown of information. It's outrageous.
Why does that have to be? And this created like massive change in Australia. Gun buyback, gun control. Like nobody owns a gun in Australia anymore, right?
Not quite true. Just to dispel some of those reasons. Prior to 1996, when the massacre occurred, homicide rates were on the decline anyway. Australia does not have a gun problem. We have now more guns in Australia than we did before Port Arthur. So yes, John Howard brought in sweeping changes and removed high-powered semi-automatic rifles and pump-action shotguns and even semi-automatic 22 rifles, rabbit rifles. But we now have an estimated 4 million registered firearms in Australia, and the media are hysterically quick to decry that we also have 1 million unregistered illegal guns out there. So that's 5 million guns in a population of 28 million. That's a lot of guns. And the salient question has to be asked, why aren't we being shot in droves? In 2023, the homicide rate in Australia was 247. Of those, 27 were gun-related, and of those, the majority were criminals using guns against criminals. So
that's nothing. That's nothing. That's an average
count.
day in Chicago here. I mean,
I mean, I did look at. Obviously, I've looked at a lot of the, even there's very people are quick to demonize the United States for their gun policies, but we know that something like 80% of gun homicides in America are caused by gang violence, and that if you remove that aspect, and then you've got, things like suicides as well. It's given the population of America, you'd also have to question whether that's an issue. Yes, the school shootings, of course, are very highly emotive and, horrendous acts that people, are justified in crying for some form of ban on semi-automatic rifles. But once again, I think it's very easy to demonize firearms, but no one's looking at the sociological aspects. Why some young 18-year-old will pick up a firearm. We've had a lot of trans killers at the moment, mass killers in America. There seems to be a rising percentage of those who will pick up firearms and turn them against their schoolmates or their peers. So I think there's not enough examination of why young people with their whole lives ahead of them turn to firearms to solve their problems. Australia doesn't seem to have that aspect. It's all about the great outdoors here. Aussies love their guns. They go out in the bush, they go shooting rabbits and duck hunting and things like that. But we have had a recent influx of gang activity because of immigration. And we've recently, our state has banned machetes because these gangs are running around with knives and machetes and brawling in public environments like malls and so on. So we now have a situation where we have weapons being used by gangs openly on the streets. Never used to have that before. But generally, Australians don't resort to firearms to solve their problems. And my personal belief is neither does America.
Did you ever get the sense that Martin Bryant was handled, that he had somebody who was directing him or surrounding him or may have been a negative influence upon him?
There is certainly credible evidence that Martin Bryant, for want of a better term, was groomed. Some of the witnesses I've spoken to said that he was sort of taken under the wing by rogue elements of the Tasmanian police. Back in the 1990s, there was, for want of a better term, an old guard, and it was quite a lawless place, Tasmania, a very dangerous place in some regards. And without going into too much detail, some of the main players in the police force over there were considered not to be exemplary members of the law and order. So there were some indications that he was, in essence, groomed, and the theory is that he was set up to take part in a sort of a counter-terrorism exercise of which he was going to play a role. At the time, coincidentally, we did have what are called SACPAV exercises down on the Tasman Peninsula. These were counter-terrorism exercises, the Standing Acting Committee Against the Prevention Against Violence. And these took place, which means we had tactical police and special air service and support carrying out exercises. They do this all over the country, but that was in the months before Port Arthur. There were also a lot of indications that in the Seascape cottage in which the siege took place, that there were multiple shooters and there were accusations directed towards a special operations group police officer who Martin Bryant was referring to when he was on the phone as Rick, and that Rick was someone he knew, that he'd gone shooting with Rick. He knew Rick's wife, and that Rick's wife was high up in intelligence. All these transcripts are publicly available.
Wow, that's great.
So there is, it's once again, it's. I'm not alleging anything. I'm asking a lot of questions, but there are certainly so many aspects to the crime that have never had answers provided. The shooter had decoyed the only 2 police officers away from Port Arthur to go and find some drugs on the other side of the island. And when they got there, they found jars of soap powder. And while those 2 officers were over there, the shooting took place at Port Arthur, which is very clever for someone with an IQ of 66.
Right.
There was a lot of indication that the shooter themselves was very proficient and highly trained with firearms, that he was able to count shots, leave one round in the breech while he was changing magazines, so that if someone tried to accost him, he would not be unarmed. That he was dancing. He was stated as dancing, as in, spinning, pivoting, lifting the firearm, acquiring a target. Most of the people that were killed in the cafe were killed with headshots. So, and the shooter was firing from their hip, not from their shoulder. So it was an incredible feat, and a lot of people are saying there are indications there were third parties involved, and if they were, they would have been very highly trained individuals.
Yeah, that's also one of the things about lower IQ people, and this is proven, is they have trouble thinking outside of themselves. So everything's in the now, and they're not capable to plan or future as well as other people. So they don't think about things because they don't have elevated thought processes. So like thinking 10 years out or conceptualizing things. So when you see kind of a sophisticated thing, the event happening, it's hard to believe somebody with that low of a competency could, the step-by-step to pull it off, right? Typically, these guys operate on crimes of passion or something like that. Anger, not like pre-planning and putting everything together. Because you have to envision this. You could go in and shoot somebody at a bar and, kill 1 or 2 people, but to get 35 and drive around and do that, it's begs,
people say it's easy to pull a trigger, but it's not as easy as that. Particularly in some kind of conflict situation or combat situation, there are a lot of psychological and physiological aspects of carrying out something like a multiply staged and magnitude crime where involving the use of firearms. There's adrenaline rush, there's the emotion, there's being able to think on your feet, to improvise. You've got victims screaming, ducking, dodging, running. Some of them tried to distract the shooter. One of them threw a tray at the shooter. Someone tried to tackle them. And then they have to improvise and go from scene to scene, commandeering vehicles, avoiding apprehension. It's an enormous feat. And also people that have disadvantages also have problems with eye-hand coordination, which Martin was certainly regarded as having. He was known to be very clumsy. He was a left-handed shooter for a start. Most of the witnesses said that the shooter was firing from their right hand, which is another anomaly, and that's all tendered in witness statements. So, there's a disparity between the character of Martin Bryant and his presumed abilities. He didn't, by his own claims, he wasn't a proficient shooter. There's certainly no determination of how accurate. My understanding, he didn't go to gun clubs and learn how to shoot. And yet you've got this very calm, collected. He was described by witnesses. He wasn't rushing. He didn't spray and pray. He was very calm, collected, methodical, cold, and just executed men, women, and children. And at one point, one of the most poignant aspects of the tragedy was he executed a young mother, and she had a 6 and a 3-year-old daughter, and he killed them as well and chased the 6-year-old around the tree and shot her as well. Now that takes a particular mindset. That's a cold, calculating psychopath. I have all the reports, all the psych reports on Martin Bryant, and they're very nebulous. Some say he may have had Asperger's, and some say he had schizophrenia, some say he didn't. They don't really, none of them have determined he was a psychopath or that he had split personality, dual personality disorder. So you can read them. They're all available online. And certainly all the experts will proclaim, oh, yes, he was this, he was sadistic, and he had a plan, and he did this. But I still think, I take that with a grain of salt. We haven't heard from his mouth.
Interesting. Was he in the care of any like mental hospitals or hospitals before the killings?
No. He was evaluated by some doctors, but my understanding was that he didn't have a prescribed form of treatment. I guess mental illness was not dealt with in a sophisticated manner as it is today, but even then it's not up to par. So he may have been taking medication for schizophrenia, and I looked into that medication, and it was the sort of thing you shouldn't take if you don't have schizophrenia. So he wasn't, in essence, treated. And one of my concerns is when we look at our human monsters, we sometimes forget that this was some mother's little boy or little girl, and that Martin tried hard. He used to run little errands around the town and sell crayfish and fresh vegetables to the locals and sell little knickknacks to the tourists. He tried to befriend people at school. He was bullied a lot. And I just felt that there was no help there. If he was a ticking time bomb, as often been described, well, certainly no one was keeping a lid on that by making sure that he had proper treatment and was looked after, and certainly not being able to be provided with firearms. Though his girlfriend, Petra Wilmot, who was with him 3 months prior to Port Arthur and right up to the night before, said she was asked by one of our reporters, why did you stay with him? And she said, because he was gentle and kind and looked after me. And she said she had no knowledge that he owned firearms or that he was a shooter. So there's just an enigma, a mystery, and that's where the questions lie. And that's what I'm about, asking questions.
Right, but typically women are key into those personality characteristics of men to sniff out, secret violence and stuff like that. So for her to be with him 3 months and say no indication of like violence or violent tendencies, to me is a huge red flag. Like she doesn't notice any. Like he flew out, like he'd go into rages over petty things or something. That's very strange. Yeah, there's a lot of problems with the Port Arthur massacre, but people can research more of it. If you're watching this on Rockfin, Rumble, YouTube, you can see the WASP files. I'll put a link to the YouTube channel. Is there anything you'd like to add? I mean, I want to read through or watch some of your videos now. But anything you'd like to add, Paul?
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to talk about motivation. People often ask me, say, okay, if it wasn't Martin Bryant, why would the government do something as heinous as Port Arthur and kill men, women, and children for something as like gun control, which of course has failed because we have more guns than before Port Arthur. But I always say that anyone who studies history, and you should if you don't, going back through centuries, looking at tyrants and dictators and even major governments, should know that the oldest motivators in the book are power, money, influence, and control. Anytime there's a major trauma event, catastrophe, there are always people that benefit from that. Greed, of course, is one of the primary motivations of our less savoury members of society, particularly people in higher authority. So for me, gun control was not so much it might have been a bonus, but it was not the primary reason why. Some of the shadier aspects of government, being intelligence agencies and rogue players within government, would orchestrate or consider some form of false flag. Power, money, influence, and control. We saw that with events such as 9/11, where there was just people that did benefit from that, and there's control over the population. Suddenly you can seize offshore funding. You can arrest people and hold them in places like Guantanamo Bay without charge for longer periods of time, more surveillance. It's control over the masses. We know that the operating protocol of governments the world over is fear, control, fear, control. We only have to look at COVID as an example of that as well. It's just to get the population to comply. And that's what I believe. There are some shady elements in higher authority that were orchestrating a lot of these events. And in my opinion, Port Arthur was certainly a contender for that.
Wow, amazing. Yeah. That's a great way to wrap it up. Again, the researcher is Paul Moder, Moder, and I've titled this The Port Arthur Massacre. Is there more to the story? And there clearly is a lot more to the story. So people check out his YouTube channel, and thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right, stay there. I have to